Welcome to episode 191 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about Andrew Hill's debut on Blue Note Records from 1963, Blackfire. And this is a very recent 2019 Tone Poet reissue, part of that reissue series by Blue Note. Like pretty much every Blue Note recording made between 1953 and 1967, it's engineered by Rudy Van Gelder, and fortunately it's from the 1960s. Anything you listen to recorded by Rudy in the 1950s that's got a piano tends to have a very muffled sound, less so when he moves to his new studio in Inglewood Cliffs, and the sound here is immaculate. Sonically, this reissue does differ a little bit from the original release. Van Gelder, amongst other techniques and tricks of his, would master his records hot or quite loud, and the whole idea was that they would stand out when played in the jukebox. The Blue Note records would be louder than anything else and people would remember them. This release was recorded by Van Gelder but not mastered by Van Gelder. Kevin Gray has done the remastering, and the result is a kind of almost transparent clarity. One other difference from the original, which Gray was not able to adjust, relates to the fact that he was using, of course, the original master tapes, which were made in 1963 and had become a little bit brittle. And there is occasionally, particularly on side 2, a little bit of a warble in the piano sound. Now, that said, you have to really listen for it to hear it, I think, as an ordinary person. I know audiophiles will key onto this, but you really got to be looking for it, and it did not in any way interfere with my enjoyment of this record. Andrew Hill is one of the great figures of 1960s jazz, but he doesn't necessarily have the profile of some other players. He was a wonderful composer, an excellent piano player, quite innovative as well, but his innovations occurred at a time when there was kind of innovation on steroids happening. So people like Cecil Taylor, Ornette Coleman, John Coltrane, blowing up the whole hard bop idiom and doing all kinds of different things, the new thing, free jazz, all those things which followed. And Hill, while very much being in and absorbing all of that environment, didn't reject hard bop as such. What he did was kind of, one person's termed it, a revolution from within. He basically tried to take the kinds of genre-busting ideas and lessons from people like Coleman and Coltrane and work those into existing hard bop frameworks. So he didn't reject hard bop, he tried to advance it. He borrowed from the avant-garde, but he himself was not avant-garde. The result is a fascinating album where there's really not much that's predictable, either from track to track or within tracks, and it's an exciting listen all the way through. Despite information to the contrary, and more on that later, Andrew Hill was not born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, but was actually born in Chicago, Illinois in 1931. His parents weren't musicians, but they did have a player piano in the house, and Hill learned to play by letting the player piano play and figuring out where his fingers had to go by looking at where the keys were depressed. One of the first instruments he picked up was the accordion, and he used to busk to make money on street corners. He also played the baritone sax, and he only really starts to focus on the piano at about age 13. Being quite musically gifted, he attended the Chicago Experimental School, where he attracted a fair amount of attention. He eventually ends up studying with the famous composer in Chicago, Paul Hindemith, and there are two different versions of how they actually connect. The first of those is that while he was at the experimental school, he begins, as I mentioned, to attract attention. The composer Bill Russo identifies him as a real talent and connects him with Hindemith. But Hill also tells a story that they actually met a lot earlier when he was busking on the street corners in Bronzeville, which is a neighborhood in Chicago, with his accordion. And he would write down the music on a brown paper bag, and apparently Hindemith came up and asked him, well, what are you writing down? And he showed him it was music, and Hindemith began to basically give him impromptu lessons on how to write music and chord structure and chromatics and so on right there in the street corner, and then would make a habit of coming back, and the tutoring developed from that point. Around the same time, in addition to this formal set of classical influences, he was playing in R&B bands, sax and piano. In the early 50s, he formed his own jazz trio, and in 1955, he releases his first album as a leader, So in Love. He then begins to work as a sideman quite frequently, particularly for Dinah Washington, touring with her, and it's on her coattails that he ends up in New York in 1961. While he's settling into the jazz scene in Manhattan, he ends up giving piano lessons to none other than Herbie Hancock, who of course was from Chicago as well. He also works with Johnny Hartman. He then spends a bit of time out in LA, working with Roland Kirk, playing at the Lighthouse, and then he comes back on a more permanent basis to New York in 1962, where he restarts his recording career, first as a sideman on a record by Kirk. The next 6 or 7 years is basically Andrew Hill's golden age. He makes a whole bunch of records for Blue Note. He also makes a bunch of other records as a sideman, total something like 20-odd recordings. Worked with many of the greatest players in 1960s jazz, including Eric Dolphy, Joe Henderson, Woody Shaw, Tony Williams, and Freddie Hubbard. And in this time, his music was very well regarded because he found this lane between conventional hard bop and much more experimental avant-garde and new thing kind of playing, which was challenging and yet accessible. Then, at the end of the decade, almost as suddenly as he'd arrived in Manhattan with a big splash, he kind of departs the scene, goes off to Colgate University to get his doctorate between 1970 and 72, and much of the rest of his career is spent essentially in academia, but there are a few recordings here and there. This record is made November the 8th, 1963 at Rudy Van Gelder's studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. Alfred Line is in the producer's chair, and the lineup is Andrew Hill on piano, Roy Haynes on drums, Joe Henderson on sax, and Richard Davis in one of his very first major recordings on bass. I said I'd mention the question of Hill's birthplace again, and this comes up in the liner notes here written by a guy called A.B. Spellman, which it says that he was born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti in 1937. Not true. Born in Chicago in 1931. Why does this happen? Well, Hill says, I lied. He basically wanted to get some kind of interest or notoriety. He had an opportunity because nobody really knew him in New York. So he tells this story, and his rationale was by seeming more exotic, he would get gigs that he couldn't get as just another jazz player from Chicago. He would get booked onto the college scene, the kinds of gigs that Dave Brubeck was getting and so on, and it ended up working for him. Somewhat hilariously, the world of jazz criticism buys this hook, line, and sinker, which, you can understand because how would they know? And a lot of the critique of his work throughout the next few years references his Caribbean heritage, his familiarity with Afro-Cuban rhythms, and so on. And of course, none of this is true, and there's a great master's paper in there for somebody. More importantly than that sideshow, this is the start of one of the great spurts of creativity in jazz history, in which Hill records 5 spectacularly good albums in the space of 7 months. A little more than a month later, on December the 13th, he'd be back in the studio to record Smokestack. He then would make Judgment on January the 8th. On March the 21st, he'd record the classic Point of Departure, and then on June 25th were the recording sessions for Andrew. These records are almost without exception excellent, and this glut of recording was, of course, released at a much slower pace by Blue Note, interspersed with a number of other recordings over the next 3 or 4 years. Side 1 starts with Pumpkin. Joe Henderson on sax takes the original melody. Hill takes the first solo, which is absolutely amazing. He draws, in the space of about a minute, on almost every tradition in the 20th century history of jazz, seamlessly. The whole track is remarkable, in fact, and it's much more complex chordally than I have the vocabulary to express. Subterfuge is next, which is a really urgent-sounding track, kind of this rumbling sense of impending doom. This is another technical tour de force from Hill, where he's pounding out this kind of menacing rhythm with his left hand, he's soloing with his right. They seem almost like unconnected musical tangents, but somehow it all works together. There's also a couple of great solos by other players on this track, including by Haynes, a wonderfully rhythmic drum solo. A lot of drum solos ought to be rhythmic, but aren't. And then you have Davis coming in, again, typically very high in the bass register. The title track, Blackfire, is distinguished, amongst other reasons, for the wonderful playing by Henderson. This is a real step up for him, this record. Pretty much anything he'd recorded to date, this is a whole other level. Side 2 starts with Cantarnos, which starts with this very interesting percussive bit before Henderson states the melody, and then he solos, and his solo is sort of interwoven with these very interesting ascending lines from Hill, which are quite unusual and make this a unique sounding track. Next song, Tired Trade, is probably the most kind of straight ahead hard bop tune on the whole record. This is a vehicle for some really expressive playing by Hill and a great little solo from Haynes. McNeil Island is a ballad which begins with this extended intro from Hill. Davison comes in on bowed bass, and he's accompanying Henderson on sax at the same time. It's a very melancholy feeling track, but it's also very airy sounding. The last track is Land of Nod, which despite its name, which you think would be a lullaby, is actually this really kind of boisterous polyrhythmic number with Henderson and Hill playing these almost unrelated parts before Davis solos. Eventually, this becomes pretty much the most avant-garde piece in the whole record, but it still swings, largely thanks to Roy Haynes, who is an absolute master at reading the other players, and on this date, that can't have been too easy. This record is exciting, it's adventurous, it's still swinging. It's one of the great moments of 1960s jazz. As I said at the outset, nothing on here is predictable, and all 4 players get copious opportunities to shine. It being Hill's debut on Blue Note in the beginning of that amazing run, and also because it's Richard Davis's debut, it's an interesting record historically as well. It's been immaculately packaged by Blue Note, and it's a must for any collection of 1960s jazz. I give it 5 out of 5.